and compliance in the cloud, pragmatic approaches to reduce operational risk and protect regulated data. My name is Jerry Grealish. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer of Perspexus, and I'll be your moderator today. As we kick off, I just want to review a few housekeeping details. First, this presentation is being recorded, and all attendees will receive an email following the event with a link to download the slides and access the recording. If you do have questions throughout the presentation, please enter them in the questions box on your screen, and we'll get to the questions at the end of the session. Any questions we don't have time to get to on the presentation will be answered by one of our featured speakers offline. Lastly, it may be easier to view the presentation if you maximize your screens. You can do this by clicking on the icon in the upper right corner of the GoToWebinar window. So let's kick off by looking at the agenda for today's webinar. We'll be starting with a summary of some of the major regulatory guidelines in the EU impacting enterprises and agencies contemplating putting data into cloud environments, public cloud in particular. From there, we'll explore some best practices to consider while contracting cloud services and discuss some ways to undertake due diligence with service providers to ensure contractual requirements are being met. Lastly, we'll investigate some innovative ways to secure data that can be used to keep this data within your own environment, even when using cloud services, and provide some criteria to consider when evaluating these sorts of technologies. I'd like to start then with a key takeaway slide, and then I'll come back to this slide again at the end of the webinar just to review these points. But my hope is that throughout this presentation with the content that we'll share, that will shed some light on the major data privacy and residency concerns that organizations operating in Europe have regarding cloud computing. Specifically, that current and pending regulations associated with the use of public cloud need to be understood and proactively addressed. And once they're understood, there are specific steps that can be taken. And three areas that we'll focus on are in the contractual terms and conditions that the cloud user sets with the cloud service provider, in the diligence that the enterprise and the agency can take during the selection of cloud service providers, and then lastly, in the adoption of supportive technologies that can be used to help maintain control of sensitive data, again, even while using public cloud environments. Finally, we'll provide some tips to consider when evaluating these sorts of technologies. So at this point, I'd like to introduce our first featured speaker, Frank Jennings, who's a partner at the law firm of DMH Stoller. Frank leads the firm's commercial group and specializes in cloud and technology, commercial contracts, data security, and intellectual property. His clients come to him not just for his specialist legal advice, but also for his pragmatic approach to solving problems and managing risk. Frank is ranked as a top lawyer by the Legal 500, an independent directory for technology, media, and entertainment. He provides legal advice on all aspects of technology, including software, agile development, and cloud, to both customers as well as vendors, and is a frequent presenter and thought leader on cloud and data issues in the UK. We're happy to have Frank's participation today. Over to you, Frank.
Thanks, Jerry. Good afternoon, everybody in Europe, and good morning, everybody in the US and Canada. Thank you very much. What I'd like to do is make a start with some key regulatory guidelines. People ask me quite frequently what the regulatory status is in relation to cloud in the US and UK and Europe in particular. I'm not going to go through all the regulations that exist in these jurisdictions, as there are many, and have been called for it to be simplified or tightened or whatever it is. What I'm going to do today is focus on regulatory aspects from a data point of view. And there's probably nobody on the webinar today who hasn't heard of the Edward Snowden revelations. Since these occurred starting in June, they've been quite widespread, and the revelations keep coming. I just want to run through some of the high points for me, or low points, depending on your view. The US and UK surveillance agencies were said to have snooped on foreign leaders at the G20 summit in 2009. There have been accusations of backdoors being built into products at the request of the NSA in the States to enable easier snooping. Skype and RSA have been caught up in these allegations, although they strenuously denied that they've actively participated in this. The NSA is said to have collected address book data without the knowledge or cooperation of people like Yahoo, Gmail, Hotmail, Facebook. The NSA is said to have cracked mobile phone encryption, and alleged to have listened to the phone calls of Angela Merkel, who's the German Chancellor. There have also been allegations that they've targeted the Israeli Prime Minister and the EU Competition Commissioner, just to name a few. More recently, we've seen that Angry Birds has been one of the mobile phone apps which has been criticized for having a lack of security, which has enabled it to made it easier for NSA to collect personal data while people have been playing that game. And more recently, just over the last week or so, we've had allegations that the NSA has been engaged in corporate espionage, where it's not specifically set out to gather corporate data. Where it's done so as part of its mass surveillance, it's been able to use that to its advantage, has favored US companies. Again, those allegations have been denied, and what strikes me is that there's an awful lot of noise being made about this, a lot of heat, if you like, and not much light. So perhaps this is a useful point for me to run through the regulatory guidelines to try and shed some light on this. There are a number of powers which enable them to do this. On your slide, you've got in the US, you've got the USA Patriot Act and the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. Until relatively recently, until the Snowden revelations, the USA Patriot Act was the one that people had heard of, but now we've got this FISA, which is where the NSA has been acting with the bulk of its powers. This enables them to engage in mass surveillance, and unlike what people have previously been saying, including me actually, there's absolutely no reason for the NSA and FBI to be snooping on anybody other than criminals, terrorists, and political activists. In fact, the NSA has taken a broad brush approach and just simply collated data on a massive scale. Hence, everybody's concerned that they're not just seemingly targeting those who are up to no good. In the interests of national security, so they say, they're targeting everybody, including the likes of you and me on the webinar today. And this has led for calls for people to abandon US cloud or anything which is outside of the European Union from an EU perspective. There have been calls by the European Commission to abandon the safe harbor regime because of this flexible or permissive surveillance environment out in the States. But what I find is that this is in complete ignorance of the fact that each national government has its own surveillance agency and has powers which are pretty much as broad brush as those in the States. So, for example, in the UK we've got the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act, which goes by its neat acronym RIPA, which conjures up other visions, perhaps almost appropriate in a mass surveillance kind of context. The French government and the German governments, who have been quite loud in their protests about the NSA surveillance, have also got these powers and have also been using them. It's just that the Edward Snowden revelations have been largely focused on NSA and GCHQ. I think it's fair to say that everybody is, every national government is undertaking some kind of surveillance for the purposes of national security. And the final point to remember in relation to this is that, notwithstanding suggestions that we keep data in the EU as a means by which we can prevent the NSA from snooping on the data, this flies in the face of the fact that each government has signed a mutual legal assistance treaty, under which their national security body may share information with other national security bodies. So keeping data in the EU doesn't necessarily prevent the NSA from getting access to it, because each EU government will have access to it, and they can share it. It's worth mentioning at this point then that this falls against the backdrop of the data protection regime in the EU, and this is why a lot of people have been concerned, is that supposedly a lot of this data is protected in Europe. Personal data is supposed to have been protected under the Data Protection Directive, and people have said, well, will the data protection regulation step up the enforcement? I think, again, people are missing the point here. The purpose of the EU Data Protection Regulation is to try and iron out some of the issues with harmonization across the European Union. The way it works at the moment is you've got 27, 28 different approaches to data protection across the whole of the European Union under the directive, and that's not proven to be a particularly harmonious regime for data protection. So the draft Data Protection Regulation will harmonize that at the EU level. However, it won't prevent NSA snooping, it won't prevent GCHQ or any other body snooping, because there's an express exemption for processing personal data without consent of the subject, as we're all called. We are all data subjects. The security bodies can still undertake surveillance on our personal data without asking our consent, where it's for the purposes of national security, and this is exactly the excuse that they're using at the moment to undertake this surveillance. So nothing will change, and it's important to remember that national security agencies will continue to undertake surveillance. That's what they're there for. The data protection regulations won't prevent that from happening. And what it's just worth noting at this point that President Obama has actually responded to some of these concerns about surveillance and has promised to reform the NSA, although from my reading of the reforms they don't really amount to much and nothing will change on the ground. The UK government has been a little slow in coming out to some extent with President Obama threatening to reform GCHQ powers, but there has been a report recently by a prominent lawyer in the UK that perhaps a lot of the GCHQ mass surveillance snooping has been conducted unlawfully. So whether or not that changes anything, I think it's important for everybody in the webinar today just to take a view that it's quite possible that national security agencies will be able to get access to their data. If that causes them some concern, then they should be taking active steps to look after their data by categorizing it and protecting it for one shape or another. And we'll go through that in a bit more detail during the rest of this webinar. So turning to my next slide then, how best can customers approach best practice in their relationship with their cloud provider? Or if there are cloud providers on the webinar today, these are the kinds of issues that customers are raising with cloud providers, and it's a neat opportunity for cloud providers to respond to those concerns and stand out in the market and frankly sell more cloud to customers who are asking these questions. If you can address these concerns from a customer or provider perspective, then in theory you should have a better provisioned cloud. So first up, does the customer's local law apply? And for those who will point out that pure cloud means that you can run it anywhere in the world, anytime, accessible instantly, you're absolutely right. And a lot of the US cloud, a lot of the cloud is based in the US for that very reason. It's easy to set up something in one place in a data center and make it accessible internationally. But what we're finding is that a lot of providers are building local data centers. And as part of the operation to move into a particular jurisdiction, whether it's concerns about data protection or whether it's simply to have a better presence on the local scene which reduces latency, what we're finding then is that as operations set up locally, this gives them the opportunity to offer customers local law. Customers, of course, are going to be a lot more comfortable signing up an agreement which is under their local law rather than something which is under a law jurisdiction which is whatever 6,000 miles away. So those first 2 points are reasonably connected, is that if the data can be stored locally to the customer in a local data center, and the customer is given the opportunity to sign up to a contract under his local law, and these are both key steps which work in the customer's favor. So from a provider's perspective, if you're looking to invest in a local jurisdiction, these are the benefits that you can pass on to your customers. Next up, then, point 3, are the SLA promises achievable? I act for a number of providers and customers, and I get to see both sides of the spectrum here. As on the one side, you get people making, providers making promises to entice customers to sign up, and it's a competitive market out there. If they don't make the kinds of promises that you're seeing out there, then customers might not be willing to sign up. And this is what customers are looking for. However, some of these promises aren't always achievable. The 100% availability, or the 100% secure, or it's unhackable, or it's the best, or it's the fastest, or whatever it is. The chances are, by the time it's gone through somebody like me, somebody who specializes in cloud law and writes cloud contracts, the chances are they won't make it into the contract. Or if they do make it into the contract or the SLA, there'll be so many provisos as to water it down anyway. So when we say 100% availability, what we mean is it's 100% available except for all the times that it's not, of course. And the main issues where it's not going to be available is where there's planned maintenance. Scheduled maintenance is normally excluded from 100% availability. And of course you've got the so-called force majeure or acts of God situations, or the emergencies. And then we get into a debate as to whether something is genuinely an emergency or whether the cloud provider should have provided better for that emergency, whether it's foreseeable. So all these kinds of things are going to be excluded from an SLA. So from a customer's perspective, they need to go into a cloud relationship with their eyes open. They need to make sure that the contract gives them what they expect it to be given, and don't be afraid to ask the question. When you say 100% available, do you really mean 100% available? My next point, has the provider shifted all risk to the customer? I see this in a lot of public cloud contracts, particularly from US providers. And in some respects, this has kind of reset the landscape 20 years or so in the early days of IT contracts, where the IT provider was so thrilled to actually be providing any kind of service whatsoever that they excluded all risk to the all of their risk and passed it all on to the customer. The customer had to take this on the chin if they wanted to have this new, exciting, innovative service. And in some respects, public cloud is doing the same. What I mean by this is I get to see plenty of the services provided as is, and service credits are your remedy if it's not provided properly, if it just doesn't comply with the promises that we made in the SLA. You have to claim those service credits, so not only are service credits an inadequate remedy, but you then have to actually claim them. And of course, it's caveated with the fact that this is your sole and exclusive remedy. I've also seen plenty of exclusions for loss of data, and yet in some environments in public cloud where the provider is storing your data, that's exactly what you want them to do, is to look after your data. You don't want them to lose it, and you don't want them to exclude liability for doing so. So there's a whole bunch of things that customers need to be thinking about when they're entering into a relationship. And from a provider's perspective, as I say, if you can nail these issues for customers, then you can provide a better service, and you're more likely to sign up customers. So moving on to the next slide, on my fifth point, can the customer upgrade to get a better, more resilient service? What we're finding is that a lot of providers are going in with the entry-level prices, which is to say, this is your public cloud, or this is your cloud for this price. Move to cloud because it's cheaper, better, flexible, scale, etc., etc. But actually, what we're finding is that by the time the customer puts back in a lot of the concerns, or addresses a lot of the concerns, puts back in some of the checks and balances that they would expect to do on an on-premise solution, builds in resilience or the data security or the business continuity or whatever it is, then that will generally add to the price. And I don't want to get into a discussion about whether cloud is always cheaper or whether it's not always cheaper than on-premise, but certainly a customer can often get a better provisioned cloud if it's willing to pay more and upgrade the service. And from a provider's perspective, they would be quite happy to charge the customer more. The next 2 points are kind of linked as well. Can the provider change the contract at will? If the customer has gone through all the trouble of migrating to the cloud and has negotiated the contract to make sure it's managed its risk, the last thing it wants then is for the provider to simply update a new set of terms at will, which then overcomes all those heavily negotiated amendments. Again, perhaps this is more likely to happen in a public cloud environment where it's mass-produced for one-size-fits-all kind of cloud, in which case then the provider probably won't be responding to individual concerns, but it's one to watch out for. And the other one, of course, is can the provider terminate at will? Again, if customers moved into cloud, the last thing they probably want to do is for the provider to give them 30 days notice to migrate out, failing which they'll turn off the cloud and delete all the data. So from a customer's perspective, they need to make sure the contract doesn't contain these types of provision, which would undermine their position. The customer should be able to migrate from this from one cloud to another as and when they're ready. If the cloud is truly flexible and scalable, then the provider should be willing to provide for this. That's of course more likely to be in relation to public cloud. When we moved into a private cloud about a year ago, my CFO said that actually he didn't want to jump around at will. He wasn't looking to get out of private cloud quite so quickly, and certainly he didn't want our provider to be able to terminate at will either. So it's much more of a locked-in kind of contract. But my CFO from the customer side of things now is quite happy with that. So that leads me neatly onto my final point. Will the provider migrate the customer, or is the customer locked in? Well, quite often customers have the concern that they'll get locked into a proprietary cloud. They won't be able to move out afterwards. And that's for those who actually think about these things up front. All too often, customers are so excited about getting into a new relationship that they forget, and maybe this is just a cynical lawyer in me, that actually all good things are likely to come to an end, and at some point the customer might want to move out again. So it's all too easy to get into a contract. What customers need to be thinking about is how to get out of a contract, and what kind of assistance will the provider give them to help them move on. And the providers I've helped moving on, customers who aren't happy anymore, are more than happy to help migrate them out. The last thing they want is a customer who's not happy with the service for whatever reason. It might just be a change in the service or just change in direction for the customer. The last thing the provider wants is somebody who's going to be difficult, and they're quite happy to migrate them out. So moving on to the next slide then, coupling the issue of data and best practice in contracts, what else can the customer do? Well, they can take, what they can do is take steps to evaluate the provider before they jump into a contractual relationship with them. So for example, we've touched upon this a minute ago actually. Does the provider own the data center? Does it have one which is local? Is it outsourcing it? Is this really important to customers? Some customers say that actually they're quite comfortable dealing with a smaller cloud aggregator or provider who's reselling services and using a third party's data center, because then they know that they've got somebody who's responsive and agile, small enough to listen to their concerns and build a tailored cloud, and yet it then is backed up by somebody who's got a large data center, who's reputable and is not going anywhere. They're quite creditworthy. Equally, some customers come to me and say, well, I'm not happy about the cloud aggregation or brokering or reselling model because there's too many small people involved in it. I want my provider to own their own data center because that gives me comfort that my data will still be there at the end. There's pros and cons of both, and from a customer's perspective, you just need to evaluate this and make sure you're comfortable. Again, from a provider's perspective, investing in your own data center can cost millions. And it's one of those issues as to, from your business point of view, are you willing to do this, or are you quite happy reselling services from a reputable Tier 3 data center? I think, as I say, pros and cons of both. My second point then is fleshing this out. Is the provider reselling third-party services, and particularly in relation to data, which we've touched upon, but also it's worth bearing in mind other third-party services. The cloud aggregation model allows for this, where a provider can sit in the middle and bolt together services from a number of different providers and sell it to the customer with a wrapper around it, so that the customer has one port of call for somebody. They can go to their provider and say, I want you to fix this. And that can give the customer some comfort. Some of the providers I deal with do this type of approach, and they say that if this isn't working out, if this data center or this software or this whatever it is isn't working out, this business continuity plan isn't working out with that particular provider, for you, the customer, we will simply get rid of this particular provider and migrate everything over to a new provider. So it takes away some of the pain from the customer. So reselling and aggregating is not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, it can be a very good thing. So from customers' perspective, you just need to go in with your eyes open, ask questions, and understand what you're getting into. The third question and the fourth are quite important too, and they're also linked. Is the provider creditworthy? How do you know? What have you seen? Have you seen their accounts? Have you done diligence on them to obtain their annual accounts? Have you asked them what their current position is? Some of the providers I've advised have been willing to give up their monthly accounts to customers to reassure them that actually, although this is new, exciting, and innovative, they're not going anywhere because their balance sheet is so strong. So customers don't be scared of asking that of the right provider. Now, obviously, you're not going to rock up and ask for Rackspace's or AWS's balance sheet, but certainly it's something that you should be thinking about. And the final point, of course, is if a customer moves all of their crown jewels, their IT, their data, everything into the cloud, they need to make sure that that cloud provider is still going to be there at the end. What they want to know is what happens if the provider becomes insolvent. So having done all your checks and made sure that you thought that they were creditworthy, what happens if the worst happens and the provider goes bust? We've seen this in the UK with 2E2. This has caused uproar 18 months ago when this first happened, because the first thing that the insolvency practitioner did when they were engaged was to ask customers to pay more money immediately on the spot. just to keep the cloud up and running. And this is going to happen each and every time. It's people have said, well, that won't happen again. Well, my view is it will happen. It will happen exactly the same way every time. So from a customer's perspective, what you need to do is make sure that you've got a backup plan, and don't be afraid of asking the cloud provider what that backup plan is. Does that mean that you end up with a step-in rights, so that you can step in and come and grab this data, or your IT environment? Well, that's only going to work if there's a third party involved, in which case the reselling model that we talked about a minute ago could actually work to the customer's advantage. Or maybe you'll get some kind of local copy or local environment for the data, so that if anything does happen, and some of my provider clients do this, is they offer a local copy of the data. If anything happens to them, all the customer needs to do is pick up the SAN drive or whatever it is and run off to one of their competitors and say, this is what my former provider was giving me. Can you do something with this? There are other options out there which I've discussed with providers, including posting an encrypted copy of the customer's data into a public cloud, although given NSA concerns and GCHQ, perhaps that's not as viable as it seems. But certainly there's a whole bundle of things that customers need to be thinking about when it comes to appointing a provider. They also need to be thinking about whether the provider can give them everything that they need, all the comfort that they need, or whether they should be working with an additional security provider to provide them with the layered security that they need. So it's not just one particular provider because they're one size fits all, but you can a customer can seek to obtain services from a number of different levels to make sure that their data and their environment is safe and will continue to be, even if anything happens to the cloud provider. One final point before we move on now is in relation to the location of the backup data center. It's all very well focusing on the data center in the UK or Europe or wherever it is, and quite often I've seen customers say, because of concerns over NSA snooping, we want to keep all our data in the EU. Like I said, that's not going to prevent the German or the UK government from snooping, and it's not going to prevent them from sharing it with NSA anyway. But the second thing to think about, of course, is that if there is a backup copy held out in the States or Singapore or wherever, then this might actually circumvent the whole purpose of keeping the data in the EU in the first place. And some of the provider clients that I advise say up front, they're quite willing to be open about this, that our primary data center is based in London or Frankfurt or wherever, but our secondary data center is based out in California or Texas. So there's a whole bunch of issues that you need to be thinking about when you're appointing a cloud provider, and from a provider's point of view, there's a whole number of issues that you can raise with your customers to try to address their concerns. So just before I hand back, on my next slide, there's some takeaways from me there. There's a number of reports just to prove that lawyers don't always do things for a fee. There are a number of free reports available which you can get after this webinar. The one on the top left there, Secure Your Data in the Cloud, was written specifically in relation to concerns that data can't possibly be kept securely in the cloud, can it? This is a joint report that I've written with a number of providers, including your host today, Perspective. And there are a number of other papers that I've written there, including Contracting Cloud Services, a Guide to Best Practice, which I wrote for the Cloud Industry Forum in the UK. Anyway, at this point, I'd like to hand back to Jerry. I hope that's been useful.
Thank you, Frank. And just a note to folks that the report that Frank just referenced, that'll actually be sent out as a part of a follow-up email to all the registrants to the webinar as well, together with the slides. I know a number of questions have come in that people have input into the question box. Just a reminder to the audience to please enter any questions you have, and given the time constraints we have on the end, we'll get to as many as we can. At this point, though, I'd like to transition to David Stott from Perspective. Perspective is a leading software company that develops what's called the Cloud Data Protection or Cloud Data Control solution that is used by enterprises to secure sensitive data before it leaves their control and enters cloud environments. So David will describe the concept and how it's used. David's, I think, extremely well qualified to comment on it because he's the Senior Director of Product Management at Perspective, and he's responsible for defining and executing Perspective's product strategy. He brings over 20 years of product management, product marketing expertise from companies such as Coverity, Angoss Software, ADP, and Ironside Technologies. He's an active member of a number of industry associations associated with cloud and security, such as the Cloud Security Alliance, the International Association of Privacy Professionals, as well as the Canadian Cloud Council. Canada happens to be David's home country. He's based in Toronto. David, it's all yours.
Thanks, Jerry. So what I want to do in my section of the presentation is really kind of take continue the discussion from Frank's key points and talk a little bit about the types of control solutions that are available to organizations that want to introduce additional measures above and beyond potentially relying solely on agreements and SLAs with the providers themselves, who want to take additional measures to protect the privacy, residency, or security of their data as part of their an enterprise program. So in first doing this, I want to introduce the solution space most generally, and I'm going to use to do that the description that was defined through Gartner, but again, as of today, other analyst groups sort of watch and evaluate and describe this space. But initially, Gartner defined this class of solutions as what's referred to as cloud access security brokers, and it's not a particular one singular solution, but rather an ecosystem of component solutions. Gartner estimates, in terms of market size, that by the year 2016, that 25% of enterprises will have adopted one or more than one component technology within this cloud access security broker framework. The types of solutions that it includes are things like identity management, so identity as a service, cloud encryption or cloud control gateways, and others. And obviously, the key business objectives or drivers would dictate the appropriate solution or combination of solutions within this ecosystem, and of course would be part of your collective evaluation strategies. So what we're going to focus on, just to kind of peel the onion and drill into a bit more detail, we're going to focus on the cloud control gateway. We're going to talk a little bit about the Gartner definition, the analyst definition of that space, then talk about key defining characteristics and qualities that would be important for evaluating these types of solutions. So one of the component technologies in the Cloud Access Security Broker framework is the Cloud Encryption Gateway. We're going to refer to it here as a cloud, more broadly, a cloud control gateway. And these types of solutions are ideal in cases where the primary business objective is enablement of cloud adoption, where there are prevailing data residency or industry compliance obligations. And by data residency, here I'm using the term to mean circumstances whereby an organization is required to keep certain classes of information resident within a specific sort of geographic jurisdiction, right? So certain types of data under these requirements cannot leave certain borders. These types of restrictions naturally make cloud adoption very difficult, given, as Frank outlined, the ubiquitous sort of the global nature of cloud, right? By industry compliance obligations here, I'm referring to sector-specific guidelines that regulate how certain types of information needs to be managed. And examples here would be sector-specific guidelines, for example, in healthcare, in financial services, et cetera, as they relate to, for example, patient information or banking consumer information, respectively. So in general, we have these sort of data residency and or industry compliance obligations. And this is kind of an ideal type of approach would be the adoption or the evaluation of a cloud control gateway. And we'll talk about these obviously in more detail. But in general, we would be looking for best-in-class solutions here to provide a range of flexible and configurable techniques or features that would, one, be themselves feature-rich, so they would support for example, audit functionality, so you could track and measure what data is being accessed. They would include things like encryption and tokenization options, which we'll discuss in more detail. And they would also interoperate nicely, elegantly, with whatever other existing ecosystem solutions you may already have in place. So if you were already, for example, today using identity and access management or single sign-on, data loss prevention, DLP, antivirus, and malware, these cloud control gateways should really be able to interoperate and leverage those existing investments in terms of if they are indeed a best-in-class solution. So let's go into more detail about how these approaches work. So these are generally, and I want to get, I'm going to say dangerously technical, probably a little bit technical here for those on the webinar. These cloud control gateways typically use what we call a proxy-based approach. So basically, as the diagram here indicates, they are designed to sit between the users of the cloud provider and the cloud provider themselves, and they normally sit within inside of the network of the enterprise. And they would allow for both, obviously, internal users to connect to their cloud via this gateway, but we also might have application-to-application connectivity, remote workers, or mobile users that would also need to leverage and be able to leverage the same types of proxy approach to ensure that any information that passes through it is potentially encrypted or tokenized or audited based on whatever policy is defined. And we'll talk about that in more detail. So the next diagram I'm going to show is a bit of a schematic that just kind of paints a picture of what the real-time operation of this class of solution would be. So as data is going out to a cloud application, so for example, if I'm going to pick an example, I'm going to pick on our friends at Salesforce.com for a moment. Let's say we're using Salesforce.com and we're going to be editing or creating a new contact. So that contact information, for example, may contain personally identifiable details that, based on our requirements, shouldn't leave our jurisdiction, right, hypothetically. So in that case, we've configured the gateway to protect first name, last name, email address, probably mailing address as well. And what the gateway is going to do is, unbeknownst to the user and in real time, intercept that transaction that's intended for Salesforce.com. It's going to identify those sensitive fields of data, and it's going to apply whatever type of control technique has been configured, i.e., again, we'll talk about more detail about audit, encryption, and or tokenization, such that for those sensitive fields, only replacement data is actually sent to the cloud. So the cloud, the data at rest, outside of your jurisdiction and even outside of your enterprise, could be in a tokenized or encrypted state, such that really the sensitive data, again, never leaves your control, right? And as data is returned, so for example, if a user loads a record, that same record is going to come back through the gateway. Any tokenized or encrypted data is going to be recognized, and it will be detokenized or decrypted before it is returned to the browser, again, in real time. So again, the user, as far as they're concerned, they're working directly with their cloud provider, and that's obviously critical. Now, again, and we'll talk about the other aspect of this, which is the ability to preserve application functionality. But this is sort of the key operational flow, the ability to intercept, identify sensitive data as it's been defined in the policy, and then provide for real-time enforcement of that policy, both as data is leaving the enterprise and when it is coming back, the data needs to be restored similarly. And that's sort of how the gateway concept works. So I want to talk a little bit about different techniques then to enforce control, specifically encryption, tokenization, and audit, as we talked about earlier. So I'm sure everyone's familiar with the concept of encryption. Encryption protects data by obscuring values using ciphers and keys. Most commonly, you probably heard of AES, which is the Advanced Encryption Standard, and there are other sort of recognized encryption cryptographic solutions and ciphers that are used. Specifically, when thinking about the cloud encryption gateway or the cloud control gateway, best-in-class solutions, you really want to look for a real-time, low-latency impact. Again, it's important that the encryption operations take place so that there's no impact on the end-user experience using the cloud provider. Key here is that the ciphertext is an open, publicly available, publicly vetted encryption module or standard. What we don't want, we definitely don't want to avoid are any types of cryptography that have been innovated to weaken the cipher in a way that is intended to support the application functionality, right? So while it's important to support application functionality and not break the app, there are other ways to accomplish this that do not involve weakening the strength of the security. These go by a number of names. Any kind of encryption that's sort of qualified, we would recommend that you be leery of. So things like operations preserving encryption, function preserving encryption, or even searchable encryption. All of those things sound very innovative, but again, they typically indicate types of innovation that would be unhelpful to the security posture of the application. And the last point there reinforces that in general, we would look for applications or recommend applications that support the use of recognized cryptographic standards and modules, as opposed to those, obviously, that are purporting to use proprietary cryptography. Tokenization is another option in the use of these control gateways. So we talked about that policy that could protect data before it leaves the enterprise. With tokenization, what's happening is the system would be replacing data as opposed to transforming it. We'd be replacing it with a surrogate value, or what's known as token, for the original data. And the token value is sent off to the cloud and is stored in a kind of a lookup table or a secure database, such that when that token is returned, the gateway can look it up and say, yep, that's the token for John. I'm going to replace that value with John. Tokenization tends to be the preferred approach when data residency is the primary objective, right? Because with tokenization, in no way does the sensitive data ever leave the enterprise. It's been argued by many in the industry, auditors, et cetera, that even with encryption, in some cases, the encrypted version of the data is still a mathematical derivation of the data itself and can be decrypted outside of the jurisdiction, right? Whereas with tokens, if done properly, the tokens have no relationship whatsoever with the data they represent. They may be randomly generated, et cetera, such that you can't hack a token. You cannot determine the clear text by looking at the token itself. So they really do provide for data residency. Again, here, best-in-class solutions we would advocate have been third-party evaluated, can produce security audits and reports that indicate sort of rigorous evaluation of these systems. And in addition to that, they solve for the possibility of collisions. A bit of a technical term, but basically, if certain types of token generation could allow for different values to actually have the same token. So if you are using things like hashes or other one-way ciphers or random number generators to create tokens, it's possible for John and Smith, for example, to have the same token. This could introduce all types of sort of data integrity issues. So you want to ensure that the system's been designed in a way that prevents for the possibility of these types of collisions. Audit is a key function. So in many cases, tokenization and encryption needs to be augmented with the use of audit. So audit would provide for the option to create audit trails of specific types of cloud access behaviors. So for example, we could create an audit record whenever a user accesses a CRM system with access to a VIP account, or for example, whenever a public sector account is accessed, etc. We could create an audit record whereby any changes that are made to a CRM system or SCM system after business hours, considered deemed suspicious, therefore create an audit trail. In many cases, the challenge with audit is that the cloud providers themselves, if you are using multiple cloud providers, do not have a ubiquitous framework for audit. They don't all support the same types of audit functions. They don't all support audit in the same way. So certainly you could pursue logging as provided by your cloud provider. However, it typically would be just operationally difficult given the range of support for these types of behaviors. Right? And again, audit may work standalone, or it may work with the tokenization and encryption options that we've discussed. So we want to close. I want to close this really quickly with 3 key recommendations if you are evaluating this class of solution. The first one is really I want to reinforce, in addition to all of your functional evaluation and the types of things you would put the system through in terms of feature functionality, I want to stress here the importance of validation. Right? So as an enterprise, as a class of enterprise software, the CASB market, the Cloud Access Security Broker market, is relatively young. And that's obviously we get to take advantage of the innovation that entails, but it also means that we want to look for proof points, right? So it's very critical we talk to existing customers of our class, pedigree, industry, etc., to gain their feedback on specific vendor solutions. We want to talk to analysts. Analysts, from our experience, tend to have an inside track or an inside view of the solutions that often does not make it to the marketing literature. The analysts talk to both customers as well as the vendors themselves. They have a view to the roadmap, so they would be key providers of information to us in terms of validation. And I mentioned this previously, but again, I think kind of reflecting other points Frank made about the importance for assessments and validation. Seek out, if not demand, third-party assessments. Best-in-class providers would be able to provide security types of reviews, forensic audits, etc., against the technical design and/or implementation of their solution, and ideally against prevailing standards. So, for example, if it's tokenization, the PCI DSS organization publishes standards for tokenization, etc. Key point number 2 is understand the operational impact. So beyond satisfying the technical requirement of controlling access to data, ensuring residency and security requirements are met, we want to look beyond then to the how, the how of the solution approach in terms of how it does that. And this really gets into things like, how easy is the system to configure, to manage, and to monitor? How capable is the system to scale? If you were to start with put one cloud behind this gateway, and then a second, and then a third, how would it accommodate these types of scenarios? Does the gateway sort of fit within your IT posture? Does it, and your prevailing operating standards for enterprise software? Does the solution, leverage existing investments you've made in other related security ecosystem solutions? So we talked about things like single sign-on and DLP and AV. Does it interoperate? Does it play nicely with these? And so we oftentimes we'll use the term here enterprise readiness. And in general, I guess the question is, from an operations perspective, is the solution, ensure the solution is quote-unquote enterprise ready? And last, but by no means least, the introduction of the cloud-controlled gateway can't have a material impact on the end user of the cloud service. So whether you're using a cloud service for CRM, human capital management, HCM systems, supply chain, etc., these are all critical business functions, and the introduction of tokenization or encryption, etc., can't have a debilitating function or a compromising function on those applications. So you really want to understand how the vendor has enabled the preservation of application functionality, and there's really 2 models. They may have brought services into the gateway to support things like searching and reporting, so that the user has no impact. There's no impact to those types of functions, or the vendor may have gotten cute with the security, with the encryption and the tokenization, to allow the cloud to perform these functions. So it's key to understand, number 1, that the business application is not being impacted, but equally importantly, how the vendor has gone about ensuring this, right? So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Jerry.
Thanks, David. And I'll just do a quick recap on the key takeaways, so we'll have then a few minutes for some of the questions that have come in. And thanks for those that have submitted questions, we have some good ones to address. So clearly, given what Frank described, there's shifting sands from the regulatory side of the equation with events occurring in the States as well as in Europe, Asia Pacific as well. So the organizations need to take proactive steps to understand the implications of these changes on their use of cloud. And not only these external changes and regulations, but also their own internal policies on privacy and security that are also probably adjusting given some of the headlines that have been in the news. So the key part to recognize is that there's multiple levers for the enterprises and agencies to look to address these issues. Clearly, from a contractual perspective, as Frank has pointed out, there's a number of things that can be done to try to work with the cloud service provider to manage your operational risk. There's also diligence steps that can be taken. And then for David Stott's comments, there's a series of technologies that could be deployed to help organizations maintain control over the data that is most sensitive to them, the intellectual property that they're most concerned about, and keep that within their own environment. So with that as the close to the formal content of the webinar, I'd like to then go to the next slide just to point out that the contact information for Frank and David is on the slide. So please feel free to copy that down. Again, these slides together with the report that Frank referenced will be sent out to folks via an email. And we have about 4 or 5 minutes left, so I would like to then move into a few of these questions. First one, David Stott, I'm going to address to you. The questioner is asking, am I understanding this correctly? So if the enterprise owns the token vault, then they would need to be involved with any data handover to local or foreign third parties. Is this correct?
Yeah, so I think if I answered the question correctly, Jerry, assuming there's a request for access to data of the cloud provider, so for example, if a security agency approaches a provider for access to information of the enterprise, the provider itself, whether we're using, if we're using encryption and the enterprise controls the keys, or if we're using tokenization and the enterprise controls the token vault, the agency really would have no access to, there's no valuable information that could be provided the agency from the cloud provider. They would need to go to the enterprise to make that request directly. That's correct.
So the enterprise would then need to be in the mix.
Absolutely. Okay. It couldn't happen unbeknownst to the enterprise.
Okay. Frank, I want to direct this next one to you. The questioner asks, how can I manage risk if my cloud provider will not negotiate?
That's a very good question, Jerry, and what I find is that a lot of public cloud providers are not willing to negotiate. You take what they give you, or you have to shop around. So certainly from a public cloud perspective, there's probably little chance you're going to negotiate unless you are a large government, in which case then you provided them with enough revenue that they'll negotiate their terms. Otherwise, it's just shopping around the public clouds to see which set of terms is better. Failing which, you need to think about some kind of private cloud where it's where you can negotiate everything.
Okay. All right. Thank you. See, last one, and again, I'm sorry, we're not going to get to all of these, so we'll follow up offline with the other folks that have submitted questions. David Stott, for you, the questioner understands that there's different forms, strengths of encryption. Does the same hold true for the other technique you described, tokenization?
In a sense, yes, absolutely. So what would be critical to understand in terms of evaluating tokenization is the method through which the tokens are generated. And really, there's a limited number of options, and certainly some are more secure than others. In general, while there are methods that allow for tokens to be generated mathematically, so for example, using effectively ciphers or hashes to generate tokens, these are not nearly as secure from the perspective of residency as we discussed than systems that generate tokens using sequential values or index values. So yeah, in general, we want tokens for the purpose of residency specifically, but in general as a best practice, tokens should have no relationship, ideally, with the data they represent. So there should be no math involved that sort of takes the clear value, does something with it to generate that token. And certainly there are systems that do not use math, that, like I said, use either sequencers or indexes to create those tokens.
Okay, all right, thank you. So I want to finish on time, and I think we'll be able to do that. I want to thank both Frank and David for the content and the insights they shared today. Thank you, gentlemen. And just a reminder to the folks that have attended the webinar, there will be an email coming later on today with a copy of the slides and a link to the report that Frank had referenced. So I want to thank you today for joining us, and I wish you all a good day. And please feel free to visit either website that is located on this last slide for more information. Thank you. Good day.